I'm happy to be here. My name is David Isaacson. I'm a journalist and writer from Global Reporting in Stockholm. And I'll be moderating this seminar. I've been following the global development trends for some 30 years. I've been traveling for some 150 countries and reporting on human rights as one area. And I'm very happy to have this distinguished panel here that will discuss the human right in the context of the new development agenda. So what is the new development agenda? About a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, I and a short number of other people were in New York and for the opening up of the General Assembly. But this year it was something even larger. It was the inauguration of the new development, the new Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a total impressive mess in some way. We were there waiting for hours to get in. The Pope was about to talk from the General Assembly. Malala was talking from the side. I was sitting at a table close to the French Prime Minister, Laurent Fabius, and there was numbers of these big people, the big ones in the world, that had agreed on these new goals that was due to replace the Millennium Goals that are being phased out now. The Millennium Goals from the Millennium, and they are due to come to an end by the end of this year. The new development agenda we have is the new Sustainable Development Goals is for the upcoming 15 years. And the very big difference between the previous goals and the current ones is that they have been part of a long process where a lot of people have been involved. Some 30 million people around the world has been involved in this process. And of course, this has created a lot of expectations, not least in the field of human rights. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about now. What is the role of the human rights in the new development agenda? And I will be starting by asking our keynote speaker to come up on the stage, Navi Pillay. When I asked you during lunchtime, what are you doing now? You said, no, I have no formal position. I'm just by my own. And you travel by your own. You just came in from Durban, right? Yeah. And Navi is a former commissioner. You have how many years were you the commissioner on human rights?
6 years, UN High Commissioner.
I did the High Commissioner of. That means that the human rights was your key area, your responsibility. You had a large staff working with you. So we're very happy to have you here. You will give us a keynote speech, and then we will introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So on the subject of global development, there were three key questions that the organizers identified, and one is, how has the Millennium Development Goals affected the field of development during the last 15 years? And the second question, what progress and setbacks are to be witnessed in the field of human rights? And thirdly, the new Sustainable Development Goals will be universal and not only addressed in developing countries, but all countries. How will these goals unfold, and how do we achieve them? So I'm going to give you my own views on this, because for 6 years I was working on these development goals as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights with my staff. Now, in the course of my work as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I sat through many official presentations of development policy documents, often launched with great pomp and ceremony. But when I met with civil society organizations in those same countries, it was as if I was in two different countries. So little was the impact on the ground. And also, as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I was mandated by the UN General Assembly to promote and protect all rights of all people all over the world, including the right to development. The internationally accepted framework for these rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, treaties and conventions that have been variously ratified by states. The two early major treaties, as you know, that fleshed out these rights are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The mission outlined in these core documents are the promotion of freedom from fear and freedom from want. Human rights are universal, they're interrelated and indivisible. All human rights are important and should not be graded, but made accessible to everyone without discrimination based on race, class, gender, age, or other categories. Poor, rich countries, poor and rich societies. So put simply, we need all these rights. The importance of socio-economic rights is that one cannot exercise, for instance, the right to freedom of expression on an empty stomach without the right to food. I found when I assumed my position at the UN, that's in 2008, that internationally, within the UN and nationally and locally, there was a neglect of economic and social rights. Some saw them as aspirations, not rights to which people are entitled. So when I tell you this, I'm telling you about endless meetings with governments who said it's just an aspiration. The UN started off as a political institution, as you know, to settle disputes and secure peace and security. However, over 70 years and the passage of many resolutions relating to human rights, it is clear that it is a norm-based organization. It sets values, principles, and standards. Member states of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, particularly from the South, urged me to redress this skewed focus only on civil and political rights, to the exclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development, which are of crucial concern for developing countries in particular. Now, on one of my first visits, in fact, it was my first visit to a country in Europe, I was having a meeting with this minister in government, and she discouraged me from advancing the right to development because she said, there is no such right as a right to development. You can't impose ideas from the top. They have to grow and evolve from the ground. So this is the background to how states think about these rights. And yet most of these states have ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which means development. Now, the neglect of the advancement of social economic rights is also a reality within countries. We are all aware of the people's movements across the world demanding delivery of rights, especially economic rights. Not so recently, not so long ago, we had the Occupy street protests, marches and strikes in the aftermath of the financial crisis that hit the poor and vulnerable communities most. Unaccountable and opaque decisions were taken by authorities and institutions. The resulting huge inequalities and disparities between rich and poor, and the exploitation of natural resources to the detriment of communities were the result. So it is indeed a sad state of affairs that women, especially young women, are losing their lives while giving life. We have to heed the voices on the streets. What are they calling for? They have called for international reform in development agendas, compatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 28, and the Declaration on the Right to Development, Articles 3 and 4. A few years ago, as we all know, the spark that lit the fire of the Arab uprising was the desperate act of a single human being, a graduate job seeker, who repeatedly denied the most basic elements of a life of dignity and set himself alight, and in doing so declared that a life without human rights is not a life at all. But the dry kindling of repression, deprivation, exclusion, and abuse had been piling up for years in Tunisia, across the region and beyond. The actions, omissions, excesses, and the indifference of the governments of the region were certainly at the center. In sum, what we heard from those people is fear and want. Clearly then, development assessments were not fixed squarely on freedom from fear and want, at least not for the many. It often too narrowly focused on growth, on markets, and on private investments, with relatively little attention to equality, and virtually none to civil, political, economic, and social rights. Now, even as these events were unfolding in Tunisia, the reports of government, financial, and development agencies, including UN, spoke of, and I quote, spoke of remarkable progress on equitable growth, fighting poverty, and achieving good social indicators that Tunisia was on track to achieve the Mdgs, and that it was far ahead in terms of governance, effectiveness, rule of law, control of corruption, and regulatory quality, and that it was one of the most equitable societies, a top reformer, and that the development model that Tunisia has pursued over the last 2 decades has served the country well. And then a few days later, you have a revolution there, which then spread across the whole of the Middle East. So while this was being said by the development agencies, at the same time, the human rights mechanisms and the voices from civil society were painting a different picture in Tunisia, a picture of excluded and marginalized communities, imposed indignities, and a denial of social and economic rights. This was, after all, a dictatorship. We heard of inequalities, discrimination, and absence of participation, absence of decent jobs, and lack of justice. This is not just about faraway pre-revolution Tunisia. We see a similar situation, a similar picture on our TV sets in respect of many countries today. Right now in my own country, South Africa, thousands of students at all the universities are on strike for weeks, protesting the high fees that are beyond the reach of the poor, and the poor happen to be the majority of the students. And so they demanded to know whether education was only for the rich, and their posters read, "No money, no education." The Zuma government then caved in and announced a 0% increase in fees for tertiary institutions for this year. The litmus test of justice and development is not to be found exclusively in indicators of growth or private investment, or even within the narrow confines of the Mdgs. Rather, it is the degree to which those or any other strategies and interventions satisfy the legitimate demands of the people for freedom from fear and freedom from want, for a voice in their own societies, and for a life of dignity. Healthcare, education, housing, and the fair administration of justice are not commodities for sale to the few, to the rich, but rather they are rights to which all are entitled without discrimination. And anything we do in the name of development should be designed to advance these rights, and at the very best, should do nothing to undermine them. Now, put simply, participatory development is more sustainable, more accountable development. Accountable development is more efficient. Non-discriminatory development is more equitable. And the empowerment of women, minorities, and marginalized communities mobilizes vastly more development resources to that cause. I began adding my support for a new agenda on global development because I believe it is time that we deliberately, publicly, and assertively pursue a meaningful policy towards the full and robust integration of human rights. This means giving full effect to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by including all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. It means ensuring the free, active, and meaningful participation of the beneficiaries of development, including the most marginalized, women, minorities, and the rural and urban poor. It means moving away from charitable or technocratic models of development and ensuring the accountability of duty bearers and rights holders. It means paying real attention to non-discrimination and equality, not only on the basis of gender and geography, but age and social and economic status. It means embracing strategies for the political and economic empowerment of people, especially the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. So briefly, let me address the question, how has the Mdgs affected the field of development in the last 15 years? So I would begin outright to say the Mdgs failed to take human rights into account. In fact, there is no mention of the words human rights in the first MDG declaration. This failure showed up in an unbalanced development framework, in poor specification of the global goals, targets, and indicators, in inappropriate adaptation of global goals to the national level, in non-participatory processes, weak accountability for both process and outcomes, and failure to address discrimination and inequality. So over 15 years, we have been set back because opportunities for better development outcomes were not followed. Violations of civil and political rights have been related to lower economic growth rates. Efforts to reach excluded communities have been linked to broader economic benefits and inequalities and have been shown to generate conflict, undermine growth and poverty reduction, and threaten sustainability. Some of the MDG's success stories since 2000 are now stories of deprivation, of repression and inequalities, outgrowths of narrow approaches to development in the pre-2015 era. Their message is clear. Economic growth alone is not an adequate measure of development. Equality matters, the environment matters, and human rights matter. Economic growth is unsustainable in the long term if severe inequalities remain and fester. Nor is it morally defensible to have communities of super rich and extremely poor. The MDG's narrow and selective set of socioeconomic indicators did not satisfy the real demands of development. Now, the next question, what progress and setbacks are to be witnessed in the field of human rights? Now, unfortunately, the MDGs were not explicitly aligned with international human rights standards, and this had consequences. For instance, Goal 2 was intended to achieve universal primary education, but it did not include the human rights requirement that primary schooling be free, without which universal access is unachievable. And this has been now addressed in the new goals. Goal 3, which was to promote gender equality and empower women, did not address the human rights question of prevention of violence against women. Because clearly if a woman is being beaten up at a home, she cannot enjoy some of the other rights, such as speaking up, for instance. And civil and political rights protections, such as personal security, justice administration, rule of law, good governance, and political participation were not included at all in the MDGs. The goals themselves were so circumscribed that they fell short of human rights treaty commitments. States are already under an obligation to aim for universal access to at least a basic level of social rights under the treaties. They are obliged to dismantle discrimination and achieve substantive equality beyond mere formal equality of treatment, which may include positive measures or affirmative action for excluded and marginalized groups, and to ensure the availability, accessibility, affordability, and quality of services. International human rights treaties contain obligations of conduct as well as results to ensure that states justify their outcomes by reference to their actual effort expended. The MDGs focused exclusively on outcomes. The obligation to commit minimum available resources to socio-economic rights without retrogression is an example of an obligation of conduct. Now, the new Sustainable Development Goals, you'll hear much more from our experienced panel, so let me make a few remarks here. The new Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015 represents a paradigm shift from the MDGs. The new SDGs will be universal and not only addressed in developing countries. The post-2015 agenda is a more enlightened model of development. It offers a balanced framework, a human rights-based approach, where development embraces consideration of decent work, of healthcare, adequate housing, levels of participation, fair institutions of justice, and a sense of personal security. So this is an advance. The new agenda recognizes that old boundaries between developed and developing countries are breaking down, and new players from emerging economies and middle-income countries are contributing to redefine the global economy. Growing poverty and inequalities in rich countries are affecting distinctions between donor countries and beneficiary countries. The many manifestations of globalization are eroding the relevance of national boundaries. Migrants, minorities, indigenous peoples, women, children, persons with disabilities, vulnerable, excluded, and marginalized groups require a specific, equitable, and rights-based development approach wherever they live, whether they live in a rich developed country or whether they're living in the developing countries. And governments and institutions in all countries and at all levels of development have responsibilities in this regard. As such, the universally agreed and universally applicable normative framework of human rights is more relevant than ever to the global challenges of development. It is now accepted that a post-2015 agenda for development must be a global agenda based on universal norms and universal objectives. So really, it's 70 years after the United Nations was set up that we've reached this far. It's not what we had demanded should appear in the new Sustainable Development Goals, but this is as far as we got now in making the human rights input into this document. So to be truly transformative, it will need to be set against a time frame that accommodates long-term change while also fostering accountability and progress in the immediate and medium terms. Human rights standards require free, active, and meaningful participation in matters of public affairs, including development planning. As such, the setting of goals themselves must be done through a participatory process in which all stakeholders, particularly civil societies, groups, human rights groups, women, minorities, indigenous people, and the voices from the most excluded and vulnerable groups. The enabling power of some rights, such as education. Education enables you to access to have information on what all your other rights are, for instance, and enabling rights such as decent work, social security, and sanitation to help advance other development goals would also influence the selection or prioritization of goals. So finally, let me say that once established, global goals and targets should not be transposed to the national level without giving due consideration to differing national capacities, contexts, and stages reached. The misapplication of the MDGs as a common yardstick for national progress generated unfair criticism for some and unfair approval for others, and an unfair comparison between countries. In a human rights approach, the subject is not countries, but rather the people living in those countries. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Navi, for your introduction. We will ask the panel to come up. Just 1 second. I just want to put you one question, the simple one. Are you happy with the new goals? I mean, you mentioned here some very aspect of the Millennium Goals that we stressed, that the way they were constructed, but the process that led up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Are you, as we see them now, the outcome? Are you satisfied?
It's because we struggled so hard to even get human rights language in there and to explain ourselves. This is 6 years of hard work. So I'm satisfied that we made some inroads, but it doesn't incorporate everything that we felt should be in this document. But nevertheless, I always believed, as I did in South Africa, we have a good constitution, we use it through litigation and also in deliberation. So we have something here that we can run with and get the cooperation of states.
So we have a good start for the next upcoming 15 years, that's what we're saying.
Well, we have a good start, but we need the political will and the resources to have them implemented.